Hey everyone, I'm Union, your Biology 2600 lab instructor, and in this video I'm going to talk about Lab 7, Trophic Cascades. So for the last couple of weeks, the last two labs, we looked at how populations of plants or animals grow and how we can measure them. For the next couple of weeks, the next two labs, we're going to look at the interactions that occur between different populations of species. So I'm going to start by reminding you what a population is, a group of individuals of the same species that live in a specific area. So if we look at a number of different populations that are interacting with each other in a particular area, you end up with a community. And if you add all of the abiotic factors, so non-living components, to the community, you end up with an ecosystem. So this week, for Lab 7, we're going to look at how organisms at different levels of the food chain affect each other. And next week, Lab 8, we're going to look at the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. So the purpose of this lab is to allow you to analyze data as evidence of a trophic cascade caused by the reintroduction of wolves to the Yellowstone National Park in the United States, and then to apply this knowledge to the wolf extirpation in Newfoundland and its effect on the forest community. So before watching this video, please make sure that you read the Lab 7 file. Also look at the relevant sections in the textbook, some sections in chapter 17 and 18, and Dr. LaRue's week 9 and 10 lectures. So a trophic cascade is an indirect interaction where a species at one trophic level influences the biomass, the production, the abundance, or the composition of another species at a non-adjacent trophic level. So, for example, a predator has an effect on the plant community by affecting the number and or behavior of herbivores. So let's take a look at a specific example. So this is a really simple food chain. At the top, you have your secondary consumer, which is also known as your apex predator. Underneath, you have your primary consumer, which in this case is a herbivore. And at the bottom, you have your primary producer, which includes plants. So each of these, the organisms at each of these levels have a direct and a negative effect on the organisms at the level below them. So predators, by eating herbivores, have a direct and negative effect, so they reduce their number. And herbivores, by eating plants, have a direct and negative effect on plants, so they reduce their numbers. So this is pretty simple. In terms of the trophic cascade, the interaction is going to be indirect. So we're going to look at how the predator, by affecting the herbivore, positively and indirectly affects the number of plants. So because the predator reduces the number of herbivores, it's going to positively increase or allow there to be more plants because there's less herbivores to eat them. So that's a simple example. In this week's lab, we're going to be looking at what happens with and without the presence of the predator. So I just went through the example with the presence of a predator. Well, if we remove the predator, we're going to remove the direct negative effect on the herbivores, and we're also going to remove the indirect positive effect on the plants. So what's going to happen is, what should happen, don't want to give it away, is that the herbivores should eat more plants, so you should have a lot more herbivores because nothing is eating them, and you should have a lot less plants because there's a lot more herbivores that feed on them. So the trophic cascade that we're going to be looking at is going to be in the Greater Yellowstone area. So here is the map. So down here we can see the United States. This black square here is Yellowstone National Park. So it's in Wyoming, and so this is enlarged to form this square here. Um, so we're going to be looking at the shaded area specifically. So part of the shaded area is in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, but there is also a section in Montana. So, so the reason we're looking at the shaded area is because this is where you have the largest elk and carnivore rich population. So this is where the Trophic Cascade is, shaded area. So I'm going to start by showing you a number of clips. So I'm going to point out these are not my videos, didn't create them, didn't have anything to do with them. They are just very suitable and appropriate for this topic. So I'm going to show you. I found these videos at these links below. Again, didn't make them, not mine, but I am including them because they're relevant. So I'm going to show these videos and then I'm going to summarize the content in them and go from there.
Wolves were well established in Yellowstone when the park was designated in 1872. They are arguably one of the most controversial forms of wildlife on the planet. And we've been at odds with them, certainly over agriculture and now over hunting, for a long time. They are this cultural enigma to us. We killed them every chance we got. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 decades that there's been a movement of people to say, maybe they're not so bad.
The restoration of the wolf after a 70-year absence is truly a phenomenal event. And now, in our 15th year, we see a very robust, healthy wolf population acting in this system much like it would have thousands of years ago. Wolf restoration has really improved the biodiversity of this region. We think with this top predator back on the landscape, we're seeing an impact across a large scale of food chain levels.
We went from 31 wolves to over 300 in the first 10 years, where there are 3 to 4 times as many wolves and as many packs outside of Yellowstone Park as there are inside. You have to look at the impacts of that on productivity of elk, which are the primary prey species of wolves, productivity of the vegetation. And aspen is like ice cream to elk. It's a favored food. But with the introduction of wolves, the elk population behavior has changed. So what we've got now is this opportunity for some of these smaller aspen to get above the browsing height of an elk. These aspens have a very good chance of replacing these older aspens that are now dying out.
In 1995, something really exciting happened in the nation's first national park, Yellowstone. 41 wild wolves were reintroduced here by scientists. After 100 years of being hunted, wolves could once again call this place home. The wolves thrived, but something else very surprising happened. Their return had a spectacular effect on the landscape, an effect that spread wider than anyone thought possible. So how did this all happen? In the past, wolves were seen as a risk to people and livestock, and they were exterminated from the Yellowstone area in the 1920s. The elk's main predator was gone, and their population more than doubled. Elk are both grazers and browsers, so they eat grass, shrubs, and trees. They overgraze the entire park, upsetting the natural balance of the ecosystem. Mammals like mice and rabbits could not use the plants to hide from predators, and their populations fell dramatically. Grizzly bears suffered as the elk munch away their berry supply, which they badly need to build up fat before hibernating. Pollinators like bees and hummingbirds had fewer flowers to feed on. Songbirds, less trees to nest in. Perhaps the elk's most devastating impact was how they affected the park's riverbanks. When the wolf was around, elk were vulnerable when they moved down towards rivers to drink. They would never spend too long by the water, where they could be ambushed. with the apex predators gone, they gorged themselves faster than the shrubs could grow and gathered in great herds on the lush riverbanks. The mass of elk's hooves eroded the riverbanks, so the rivers and streams clouded with soil. The fish inherited murky homes, and without trees and clean water, beavers couldn't build their dams to live in. Without the protection of the dams, fish, amphibians, and otters suffered even more. And all because of the missing wolf. Now, with as many as 100 gray wolves in Yellowstone National Park, their reintroduction is having an effect that even surprised scientists. Wolves have contributed to bringing elk numbers down from 17,000 in 1995 to just 4,000 today. Since only the healthiest of elk survive, the population is much more robust. All of these elk kills mean more carcasses for scavengers like coyotes, eagles, and ravens. Grizzly bear numbers have increased too. The grizzlies benefit from the wolves' elk kills, and less elk also means more berries. And just the elk's fear of wolves gives the riverbank trees, like aspen and willow, a chance to regenerate. They can grow to 5 times their original size in just 6 years. The songbirds are returning too. And the bigger trees along the rivers means greater root structures, which means stronger riverbanks and less erosion. Clean water and big trees, beaver paradise. The return of the beaver dams creates new habitats for fish, amphibians, reptiles, and even otters. This shows just some of the trickle-down effects of the wolves' reintroduction, known to scientists as a trophic cascade.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer.
So, to summarize the content in the videos, which again were not mine, wolves were extirpated. Extirpated is a fancy word for hunted to extinction in Yellowstone in the 1920s. So after the 1920s, there was no more wolves for about 7 decades when they were reintroduced by humans in 1995. This is perhaps the most classic example of a trophic cascade. So if you Google cascade, this is one of the top 3 examples that will come up, because it's essentially a natural experiment that happened in the wild, and we were able to get a lot of information from it, ecologically speaking. So from the videos, you know that during this area from 1920 to 1995, there was no wolves, so there was a large population of elk, which increased significantly during that time. And this resulted in a decline in the growth and regeneration of aspen, which is their favorite food source. It's like ice cream to them. So the question that our researchers are interested in, and you guys are going to be interested in as well, is whether or not the wolves affected whether or not the reintroduction of wolves in 1995 affected the growth and recruitment of aspen. So in other words, because we're looking at wolves and the effect on aspen, so non-adjacent trophic levels. So did a trophic cascade occur in this area? So I'm going to show you some data, what the elk and aspen counts were like when wolves were absent. So in this graph, up here is the number of elk, and down here is the number of aspen. So we're specifically going to focus on this area. So wolves are absent in this area. So if you look at the elk population, it's obviously present. At a certain point, it reaches over 16,000 elk, so definitely evident. And when you look down at the elk, you look at these lines down here, it's actually fairly low. So the next bit of data that we're going to focus on is this here, and this is what your write-up is specifically going to be focused on. So this data is the data that's provided in your lab report. So we have the years in the first column. So we're looking specifically after or around the time of 1995, which is when wolves were reintroduced. So you can see the wolf numbers in the second column. We started with 20, and you can see it generally increasing throughout. You can also see the effect that would have had on the numbers of elk. I'm not going to summarize that. You guys are going to be doing that. And you can also see the effect that it had on percent aspen browse, so how many aspen were actually fed on by the elk. And you can also see the effect on how high the aspen were able to grow over that time span. So you guys are going to be using the R code provided. You're going to run through some example data first, just to get an idea of how the code works. Then you're going to use the file which has this sample data, and you're going to make your graphs. So in your report, you want to include the sample data, which is this right here, and not the example data, So the question or the problem that you guys are given. Um, we know what happens when wolves are not present. You get an increase in elk and you get a decrease in aspen or higher amount of aspen browse and lower heights. So the question is, when wolves were reintroduced, does it lead to a trophic cascade in which wolves reduce the number of elk and increase the number of aspen, or at least increase the height of aspen, decrease the percent brow of aspen in the Yellowstone National Area? All right, so you should begin by logging into Brightspace and going to your course page. Then we're going to go to Lab 7, Trophic Cascades, and you will see a bunch of files there. This video file will also be linked there when you guys look at it. So this is the first file is your lab file, which contains all your information. This is your basic R code, which contains all the code to generate your graphs. And then, so this is super important, two separate data files. Your example data contains your example data. You're going to use this just to run through your code to make sure it all works and figure out what does what. And your Lab 7 sample data is the actual data that you're going to use for your lab. So you're going to make your graphs based on this, submit them, and then you're going to actually discuss this data in your write-up. This data here is made up, so make sure you don't hand in the graphs for that because you'll lose marks, and make sure you don't discuss the graphs for this because you'll also lose marks. So I have those already downloaded. So I'm going to start with the basic R code file, which looks something like this. So, so I know you guys aren't excited about using the code, but this is the last R code lab, maybe in your life. So that's probably good. So a lot of issues last time, and by last time I mean lab 2, because this our stuff is pretty similar to lab 2. So the issues that occurred then, one of the big ones was importing your files. So I'm gonna go through that again for both a Mac and a PC, and hopefully you guys don't have any issues. So the basic thing you want to do, so you can write this right in your RStudio, or you can write it in a Word file, whatever makes you happy. The basic thing you want to do is DF, which stands for data frame, and you're going to tell RStudio to read a CSV file, and your CSV file that you're going to start with is your example data, and .csv because that is the extension, because that's what type of file it is. So if you're using Windows, you find where your file is. Chances are if you just downloaded, it's going to be in your downloads folder. You left click, go to properties, and that's going to open up this window right here. So again, left click, select all, left click, copy. Then you're going to go back to this file, and right in between the quotation marks and the E, you're going to paste that in. So what you want to do first is change the direction of all of these slashes. And you're actually going to add another slash just before your example data, because I have it in my error folder, which is a separate folder, so you need a slash there. So we're going to leave that for a second and come back to it. In terms of using a Mac, it's going to be the exact same idea. So you're going to start with the basic command that has your data file, and you're going to paste in wherever your file is. So I don't have a Mac because I don't believe in Macs, but that's a discussion for a different time. So you're going to have, I got some images from the internet. So again, like I said, chances are when you download your file, it's going to be in your downloads folder. So you find your file, you're going to right click it, and you're going to have this window pop up. If you go to get info, you should have another window like this, and you're going to copy your location under where or next to where. So in case you have something before users, just pretend you don't. Start with the slash before users and go right to the end. And then you're going to paste that in here. So this one is different from the one I just showed you. This is the one this is where Jake's file is on his computer. He has a Mac. So users, Jake, blah, blah, blah. These slashes are already facing the right way, so you don't have to mess around with those. And you have your file and your extension. So I'm putting a lot of emphasis on this because I'm hoping this is the hardest part. So I'm going to copy all of this. I'm going to go to RStudio. So I only had 3 windows open. Again, these could be in a different order on your computer. That doesn't matter. So I'm going to go up to File, New File, RScript, and this opens up a brand new source pane. So the reason I'm pointing this out is you guys are actually going to be submitting your own code along with the write-up for this lab. So most of the commands are going to be found from this Trophic Cascades basic code file, but they're going to be specific to plots that you make. So the other thing to remember is this is where your code goes, but before you actually put your code over there, you want to run it through your console pane to make sure it is functioning properly, and then you can paste it over there. So I'm going to start with the basic import command that I copied, execute it, and sure enough, you get an error. So, okay, so that is actually a simple error. There is a space here. So let's hope that takes care of it. We're going to put it in here. And we're off to the races. So click on this. You're going to see the table that is in your lab. Nope, you're not going to see the table in your lab because this is the example data, not the sample data. So these numbers are messed up. But the table is showing up, so that's good. It is working. So what you should do is paste that command in here, hit enter, and you got your first command. So you can hit enter again. What you're going to do is you're going through here, make sure it works, and then paste it up here, and then you're going to save this and submit it. So I'm just going to go through a couple, then of course RM lists. You want to actually start with that. I'm not going to do it here, but make sure you guys start with it. So I'm actually going to see if it works. And sure enough, second command is working. You get your graph, and then you're going to paste that in here, hit enter, and you're going to keep doing that to get your code. So the actual code, so there's a couple methods here. Each builds on the last. The one that you're going to use to generate your graph to submit for your report are going to be is going to be method 4. So I'm just going to run through this to make sure it works because I had an error before. Nothing happens with that as expected. That's just your margins. This is also your margins. And so for the plot, cross your fingers. Don't be scared. Well, margins are too low, so let's make that a bit bigger. So, really? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, there you go. So just make your window bigger. So you can see right off the hop it's pretty squat up, but you are getting data. So let's just for a second pretend that it's not squat up. I'm just going to copy a couple more commands to show you how to solve that. And so now you get another line. So you're going to copy the rest of your commands in here. Pretend that it's not squat up. And then to solve the fact that it is squat up, you will just simply hit this zoom button. And if you maximize your window, you get a nice plot. And so we can see that everything was working out. So if you follow the rest of your commands, you'll get a graph up here like this, and you get another graph down here. Both of these are going to have 2 lines. That's going to be all 4 lines. And this is a graph produced by methods 4 that you're going to submit. Keep in mind, not with the sample, not with the example data, but using the sample data, which has different numbers. So, close that out. So, to show you what your example data will look like, the graphs are actually here in this file. They'll look like that. And that's it for that. So the last thing that you're going to do is make sure you're going to save it. So, should have probably mentioned that. So when you actually do zoom, you can go save images or copy image and paste it somewhere else and save it that way. Alternatively, you can go export and save image or save PDF, whatever you want, when you have all your commands done. So you want to do that because 2 reasons. 1, you're going to be using those in your actual report, and 2, when you go save your code, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, it's not actually going to save the graphs. So make sure you save your graphs separately. Make sure you save your graphs separately, individually. Can't stress that enough. And when you go save it, you just go File, Save As, and I'm going to save it to my desktop. I'm going to call it Lab 7 Code. And I'm just going to put my initials there for a laugh. Save it, and if I close it out, so this right here pops up because there are images saved to our data, and that is referring to these images. So this is a heads up saying that it's not going to save these images, they should be saved individually. So I'm going to click Don't Save, and sure enough, there is your code that's saved on your desktop. And if we double click that, open it up, the code that you put in your source pane is where it is, where it was. You don't have any images, and that's why you save those separately. And it should be that easy. So yeah, you saw my top graph look like this, your bottom graph will look like this, and then you're going to submit those in your report. Sorry. So clarification. This is what the graphs look like with the example data. So your graphs will look something similar, something like this, but the numbers are going to be completely different. So make sure you use the Lab 7 sample data after you run through it with your example data. So, I'm going to minimize all that. So, now that we have our graphs done, I'm going to shift to the spot here, which contains your instructions, and that looks like this. So your objectives, assignment, all those details, some background information. This is the table. So for your lab report down here, so again, this explains and clarifies example data is just so you run through your basic R code, and then you're going to use your actual sample data file, Lab 7 sample data, to run through your code and generate the graphs that you're actually using. So in terms of your report title, what was done, when and where, introduction, make sure you explain the basic concepts of the trophic cascade and some background information on exactly which organisms were involved, where it occurred, etc. The purpose of the study should be clearly stated. At the end of the introduction, you're going to make a hypothesis based on this problem here, which I already mentioned. So for the methods this time, you're going to actually describe them. So where was the study area, what data was used, what type of analysis was done, the time frame, etc. For your results, you're going to submit table 1, which is the table above there, and a graph. So you're going to have 2 graphs that have 2 lines on each, and these are generated in our studio. And you get an idea what those look like from the other file that I showed you. Of course, you're going to have some other statement that depicts the trends that are observed in the graph. Again, you're going to submit the graphs from method 4 section in that, and the graphs from the appropriate data. So lab 7 data. Can't state that clearly enough. In terms of your discussion, start off by saying if your results support your hypothesis. So based on your graphs, is there evidence for a trophic cascade, the wolf, elk, aspen cascade in the Greater Yellowstone area, and explain why you think so. So actually go into the graphs, pick them apart, and say why you think there's a trophic cascade. So one thing I didn't talk about was consumptive versus non-consumptive effects. So I'm going to talk about that now. So these are a couple questions that you're going to answer in your discussion, kind of like you did for the last lab. Put them in a paragraph or separate paragraphs, whatever, not jump notes. Yeah, So in terms of consumptive effects, so these are the more obvious ones, the ones that I've kind of been focused on so far in this presentation. So I'm going to bring in a couple of graphs from one of the studies that the researchers on this topic published. So in the top, there's 2 graphs. We're going to focus on them first. So the top graph shows you the number of wolves, and the bottom graph, or the lower graph, shows you the number of elk. So just by quickly looking at this, we can see that for wolves, there's an obvious upward trend, so the population is increasing over time. And if you look at elk, there's an obvious downward trend, which means that the elk population is decreasing over time. So considering or taking this into account with the trophic cascades that we've been talking about so far, if you look at the top 2 levels, elk are the primary food source for wolves. So it's really expected that as you increase the number of wolves, you're going to decrease the number of elk due to the fact that the wolves are eating the elk. And that is what a consumptive effect is. Reduction in numbers, specifically of elk, due to predation, specifically from wolves. Of course, it's never that simple, and this is where non-consumptive effects come in, and one of the videos did mention this. So same figure, we're going to focus on the bottom 2 graphs this time now. And so for the bottom 2 graphs, they're looking at the percent of aspen browsed or eaten and the aspen height. So I will mention that 2 of these are going to be indirectly proportional. So the more aspen that are browsed, if aspen are browsed or eaten, that's not going to allow them to grow very tall. And if they're not browsed or eaten, they are going to be able to grow taller. So trophic cascade, focusing on the bottom 2 levels, aspen are like ice cream to elk. So presumably whatever effect you see on the aspen are going to be due to the elk. So the authors for this part of the study actually went one step further, and they looked at the aspen browse and the height in two specific areas. So I'm going to bring up this map that I had at the beginning. If you look at the light gray lines, they represent rivers. So you're going to see most of the rivers are going to be down here in the Wyoming state. And as we know from Lab 1, the riparian zone is the zone adjacent to a body of water. So the riparian zone is going to be in this area. So riparian, which is shown by pink dots. And the uplands are going to be this area up here, which doesn't have any rivers and therefore doesn't have any riparian zones. And they are represented by the other color dots here. So if you look at percent of aspen browsed, the obvious thing that you can see is there's a clear difference between the aspen browsed in the uplands and in the riparian zone. And you can see there's a clear difference in the height of the trees in the uplands compared to the aspen in the riparian zone. So this brings in the idea that you're still getting aspen browse, but it's actually specific to the area. So it can't be as simple as the wolves are eating the elk and the elk are not eating the aspen, because we can see differences in the area. So this brings in the idea of non-consumptive effects. And what this refers to is the change in behavior. So the wolves are actually spending more time in these areas. And so they're hunting the elk in these areas, and the elk they're obviously picking up on that. And so the smarter ones are actually shifting up to the uplands, shifting or migrating is a better word, to the uplands where there is less wolves. And so you can see there's a higher number of aspen browsed in the uplands, and the trees in the uplands are not growing as tall. That's because the aspen are moving in this area. So again, not as simple as just being eaten. You're actually, because of the presence of wolves, you're actually also changing the behavior of the elk, which is causing specific patterns. So I'm going to go back to the report. So consumptive, so you can comment on that. Next question is, are moose in Newfoundland having an impact on the Boston fir? So I also didn't talk about that. So that's going to be coming up next. So the example in the greater Yellowstone area can be directly applied to our province. So moose are a non-native species. They were introduced to the province in approximately 1908. And around the same time, the Newfoundland wolf was actually hunted to extinction or extirpated. So with the absence of wolves, so you don't have predator, you have abundant food, you have high disease resistance, so the numbers of moose increase quite dramatically since then. So the effects on the Newfoundland forest. So just a couple of stats here from Parks Canada. Moose can eat 20 kilograms of twigs per day in the winter, so that's a considerable amount. I will mention, so we're discussing the Trophic cascade of wolves to moose to fur. So in terms of fur, during the summer there's lots of different food sources, deciduous trees, berries, all that sort of stuff. So moose usually pick the better stuff, like the berries and deciduous stuff, and they stick to eating fir trees in the wintertime because that's the only food that's available. So in Grossmorn specifically, there was a huge area that was once healthy forest, which is now treeless meadows. 75% of the stands no longer contain enough young trees to regenerate once the mature trees die. Some patches are like they're being eaten, completely being eaten, and so with the reduction of fir trees, you get a 25% decrease in the diversity of forest floor plants, and there's also related declines in bird abundance due to habitat loss. So this is again similar to what's happening in or what happened in Yellowstone. So just because you bring wolves in doesn't mean you're going to get simple effects on elk, which is going to affect aspen. You also get huge effects on several other species, including birds, etc. All right, so that is for that trophy cascade. Um, so based on that information, you can make a comment on Newfoundland moose having an impact on Boston fir. Just gave you the answer. And that's also going to help you answer this. With the presence of a natural predator, Newfoundland help impact the abundance of moose. And so essentially, if wolves were introduced, would you have a trophic cascade similar to what was observed in Yellowstone? And so this is hypothetical. Nobody knows the actual answer, but based on what happened in Yellowstone, you can formulate an answer. And you're going to finish off by making some concluding statements on passively reestablishing ecosystems. So passively in contrast to actively. So passively would be what was done. So what was done in Yellowstone. So they introduced wolves and then they let the ecosystem balance itself. And that would be in contrast to actively, which is what they tried to do, and perhaps what they tried to do before the wolves, and what they're trying to do in Newfoundland. And that would be trying to actually control the elk or moose population, for example, by increasing hunting licenses. So you're not letting the ecosystem passively take care of itself. You're actually trying to remove or reduce the number of specific organisms actively. So you can just make a comment on that, and you're going to finish off. Sorry, the last thing you're going to do is, as I mentioned before, submit the code that you generate in RStudio as an .r file. So I showed you how to save it earlier, and so your code here should include how you imported your sample data files and how you generated your graphs. And this would be for all the methods, but especially for method 4, so those are the graphs that you're going to introduce in your report. And that's it.